something deeper, a pulse of dread that told me a storm was already gathering. To understand how I, a woman who had devoted her entire career to Zenith, came to stand before a board of directors staring at me with a mixture of pity and disbelief, you need to know about that golden pen, about the call that split my world in two, and about the arrogance of a newly minted CEO who mistook bravado for strength. His pride did not merely threaten my place in the company, it was the very shovel with which he dug his own grave. If you're still listening, we want to sincerely thank you for spending your time with us. Truly means a lot. We'd love to know, where in the world are you watching from? Drop your country in the comments and let's see how far this message has reached. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, I highly recommend doing it now so you won't miss any of our upcoming stories. These aren't just ordinary stories, they're filled with meaningful life lessons that can inspire, teach, and stay with you long after the video ends. Hit that subscribe button and join our growing community. Chapter 1. The moment everything collapsed. That morning, I stood outside the boardroom, clutching a bouquet of white carnations, flowers I had chosen as a symbol of new beginnings. In my mind, they represented grace, respect, and welcome. I wanted to greet Julian Voss, the newly appointed CEO of Zenith Enterprises, with a gesture that would set a tone of warmth rather than rivalry. 25 years in this company had taught me that respect carried more weight than any title, and genuine gestures often spoke louder than strategy. During those decades, I had guided teams through crises, saved Zenith from near bankruptcy more times than I cared to count, and built a network of trust that held the company together when market storms threatened to tear it apart. I had poured more of myself into these walls than into my own personal life, a sacrifice that had become both my pride and my prison. A bouquet of carnations, I told myself, might remind Julian that he was not merely inheriting a corporation, he was joining a family. But the instant I stepped into the boardroom, I felt the shift in atmosphere. The air was tight, charged, brittle like glass ready to shatter. Julian's eyes were the first thing I noticed, sharp, cold, and utterly devoid of emotion. He didn't glance at the flowers in my hand. He didn't smile, didn't offer a word of acknowledgement. Instead, he adjusted the knot of his tie with deliberate precision, then let his voice slice through the silence like a blade. "Evelyn Harper," he declared, each syllable clipped and merciless, "your time at Zenith has come to an end." The words landed in my chest like a sudden vacuum, sucking the air from the room. I stood frozen, the carnations trembling slightly in my grip, as if my hands no longer belonged to me. Around the polished mahogany table, the newly promoted vice presidents sat rigid, pens hovering just above their notepads, caught in a tableau of uneasy stillness. They looked at me not with the respect I had earned over decades, but with the hesitant pity reserved for someone already consigned to history. I searched Julian's face for a crack, any sign that this was some cruelly misguided attempt at humor, an initiation rite, a power play designed to test me. But his eyes remained fixed and impassive, glinting with something closer to disdain than indifference. With a calculated gesture, he slid a manila envelope across the table, its surface gleaming under the harsh boardroom lights. "This," he said, his tone sharpening like steel against stone, "marks the beginning of a cultural overhaul. Zenith must shed the relics of its past if it is to move forward. Your dismissal, Evelyn, will serve as the signal of that transformation." A murmur of shocked breaths escaped the silence, filling the void his words left behind. My skin prickled under the collective gaze of the room, gazes that no longer saw a leader but a relic, an obstacle to progress. The carnations in my hand suddenly felt absurd, their once bright symbolism collapsing into mockery. I set them down on the table, their sweet fragrance now suffocating in its cloying insistence. Humiliation pierced through me like a blade. But I refused to let the wound show. Not here. Not now. Not before this man who believed he could erase 25 years of loyalty with a single pronouncement. My fingers instinctively reached for the weight in my pocket, the golden pen Zenith had gifted me to commemorate a quarter-century of service. Its engraved lines spelled my name with delicate precision, a reminder of the nights I had spent bent over crisis reports, of the flights across continents to salvage contracts, of the personal sacrifices that no one in this room could possibly understand. I clenched it in my palm, anchoring myself in its solid, undeniable presence. It was more than a pen. It was a symbol of survival, of endurance, of the fact that my story was carved deeper than any one man's arrogance. And what Julian Voss did not know, what none of them suspected, was that 2 days earlier I had signed an agreement that made me the largest shareholder in Zenith Enterprises. His declaration of victory, his carefully staged humiliation, was nothing but the spark that would ignite a reversal he could not yet imagine. Julian thought he had buried me beneath the weight of his authority. What he had done instead was hand me the stage on which to rise. The silence that followed stretched long enough to carve itself into memory. I could feel my pulse hammering in my ears, my breath tight in my throat. One of the younger vice presidents, someone I had mentored when she was still fumbling through her first project, shifted uncomfortably in her chair, her pen scratching a meaningless circle on her pad. She couldn't meet my eyes. None of them could. Their silence was complicity, but also survival. They were bound to him now, not to me. I forced my shoulders straight, though the weight pressing against them felt unbearable. The carnations lay on the table between us, stark and white against the dark wood, a reminder of the naivety with which I had entered the room. Their petals already seemed to droop, as if mirroring the collapse I refused to let myself embody. "You mistake cruelty for leadership," I wanted to say. The words burned in my throat, but I held them back. Rage would give him too much satisfaction. Silence in that moment was sharper. My composure, my refusal to break, was the only weapon I had left to wield openly. Julian's lips curved into the faintest hint of a smirk, as though my restraint only confirmed his dominance. He leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled together, surveying me like a piece of furniture he had already decided to discard. His arrogance filled the room, thick and heavy, suffocating in its certainty. But beneath my stillness, another current moved. He saw humiliation, I felt calculation. He saw an ending, I felt the tension of a beginning. Every humiliating second of that moment would become fuel, sharpened into resolve. I thought of the midnight call 72 hours earlier, the founder's voice, heavy with unspoken warning. I thought of the contract I had signed, the shares that shifted power into my hands. And I thought of the arrogance now staring at me across the table, too blinded by his own pride to recognize the trap he was already building around himself. Julian believed he had dismantled me. In truth, he had awakened me. And as I stood in that suffocating silence, the carnations fading on the polished wood, I made myself a quiet promise. This was not the day I lost Zenith. This was the day Julian Voss unknowingly set the stage for his own undoing. Chapter 2: The Fateful Call. Let us rewind 2 days, to a quiet Sunday evening that began with nothing more than the promise of solitude. I was sitting in my small apartment, a modest space I had never thought of as a retreat, but that night felt like a sanctuary. The city outside hummed faintly, muffled through the windows, but within my walls there was silence. I had curled up in my armchair with a book I had been meaning to finish, hoping its pages would distract me from the rumors swirling like smoke in the industry. The whispers that Zenith Enterprises, my home for a quarter of a century, was about to welcome a new CEO. Change at the top always carried weight. This time, however, the unease felt heavier. Whispers spread not just of new leadership, but of upheaval. For employees like me, who had given everything to Zenith, uncertainty wrapped itself around the heart like a tightening coil. I wanted to lose myself in the rhythm of words on the page, but my eyes skimmed sentences without comprehension, my thoughts drifting back to the inevitable shift that loomed ahead. And then the phone rang. The sound cut through the stillness like a blade. I reached for the device, irritation at the intrusion giving way to shock as my eyes landed on the glowing name, Margaret Langston. For a moment, I simply stared at the screen, my breath suspended. Margaret Langston, founder of Zenith Enterprises, a woman whose name was synonymous with resilience, strategy, and a kind of raw brilliance that had shaped not only a company but an entire industry. She had retired years ago, but her presence still lingered in every corridor, every policy, every whispered story told by those of us who had been there in the early days. Margaret wasn't just history, she was myth. And when a myth calls you in the middle of the night, you don't let it go to voicemail. I pressed accept. "Evelyn," she said. Her voice was lower now, aged by time, but it still carried the same crisp authority I remembered from shareholder meetings and crisis briefings. Every syllable sounded deliberate, weighed, and sharpened before it was released. "I need to see you. Immediately." There was no explanation. There didn't need to be. Margaret Langston never asked, she commanded. 30 minutes later, I found myself in her study, a room that smelled faintly of oak and old books, steeped in a kind of permanence that no renovation could erase. The space was warm yet formidable, much like its occupant. Margaret sat behind a vast wooden desk, her posture straight despite her years, her eyes as piercing as they had been when she had guided Zenith through its darkest hours. On the desk lay a neat stack of papers, organized with the kind of meticulous precision that defined her. She gestured toward them, her gaze never leaving mine. "I have made a decision," she said, her tone steady, measured. "The future of Zenith must belong to someone worthy of it. I am selling my shares, 45% of the company. And I want you to own them." For a moment, my mind refused to process her words. 45%. Nearly half the company. Ownership wasn't a concept I had ever allowed myself to entertain. I had spent my career patching leaks, negotiating impossible contracts, rallying employees through storms, and keeping Zenith alive when collapse loomed. But ownership? That had always belonged to others. The founders, the investors, the faceless entities who sat in their glass towers while I shouldered the day-to-day survival of the enterprise. I blinked, my voice faltering as it finally escaped my throat. "Why me?" Margaret leaned forward slightly, the weight of her gaze pressing into me as though she could see not just the woman I was, but the history etched into my bones. "Because I have watched," she said. "I have watched board members circle like vultures, hungry only for profit, indifferent to the soul of what we built. I have watched loyalty traded for personal gain, trust discarded for short-term numbers. But you, Evelyn, you have sacrificed more than anyone. Sometimes I fear too much. You gave yourself to Zenith when others gave only what was convenient. And that tells me you are the one who will protect what Zenith represents." Her words struck deeper than praise. They touched the scar tissue I carried, the missed birthdays, the friendships that faded, the personal life that had atrophied in the shadow of a career I had convinced myself was worth it. Margaret reached into a drawer, retrieving something small but gleaming. She placed it carefully in my hand. It was a pen. Not the commemorative one I carried from my 25-year anniversary, but something older, weightier, adorned with intricate engravings that told their own story. "This," she said, her voice softening but never wavering, "is the pen I used to sign the founding documents of Zenith. It is more than an instrument, it is a symbol. A marker of trust, of beginnings, of legacy. If you sign these papers with it, Evelyn, you will no longer be just an employee. You will become the guardian of Zenith's future." The metal was cool against my skin, yet heavy in a way that went beyond physical weight. I turned it over slowly, tracing the carved lines, feeling history press itself into my palm. My throat tightened as the reality of what she was offering settled over me. Ownership. Authority. Responsibility. My name, written in ink from this pen, would not merely authorize a transfer of shares. It would bind me to the very foundation of Zenith, anchoring me to its survival in a way no contract or title ever had. I looked up, my voice barely audible. "You trust me with this?" Margaret's expression softened, though her eyes never lost their sharpness. "I do more than trust you, Evelyn. I believe in you." When I step away fully, I need to know Zenith will remain in the hands of someone who remembers what it was built on. Not greed, not vanity, but resilience, sacrifice, legacy. The silence between us thickened, filled with the weight of her words. I glanced at the documents once more, the stack of papers that could alter the trajectory of my life in ways I had never imagined. Each page represented power, but also risk. To accept meant to carry a burden greater than anything I had borne before. I tightened my grip on the pen, felt as though the world had shifted, the axis tilting beneath me. My hands trembled slightly, not from fear but from the enormity of it all. "Margaret," I whispered, this changes everything." Her lips curved into a faint smile. "Yes," she said simply. "It does." I drew a slow breath, feeling the tremor in my hand as I lowered the pen to the page. The gold ink glided across the paper, each loop and stroke a quiet oath that settled into the fibers like a promise. When my signature finished, the sound of the nib lifting seemed excessively loud in the hush of Margaret's study. She watched me with a small, satisfied nod, the kind of approval that carried the weight of both relief and resolve. "There's one more thing," she said, her voice dipping into a conspiratorial hush. The room seemed to lean in with us. "We will keep this, at least for a few days, strictly between us." Her words landed like a stone in still water. I looked up, puzzled. Margaret's lips pressed together, forming a line I knew meant plans had already been drawn. "I want to see how people behave when they think you've lost power," she continued. "Pride reveals people. It strips them down to what they truly are." A slow heat crept up my neck. The notion of secrecy felt almost indecent, power hidden in plain sight, a puppet string unseen by those who thought themselves free. But beneath the discomfort there was a sharper satisfaction, a strategy delivered with the elegance of someone who had never confused haste for wisdom. Margaret's test was surgical, designed to expose weakness the way sunlight exposes cracks in old paint. I felt the responsibility settle anew on my shoulders. This was no simple transfer of shares, it was an experiment in human nature. Those who had smiled politely in boardrooms, who had toasted to future visions and congratulated new appointments, would now reveal whether their allegiance was to Zenith or to themselves. I pictured the vice presidents in their tailored suits, the men and women who had watched my career like a weather report, predictable, manageable. Would they bend to the new wind? Or would they show the teeth of opportunism that I had suspected for years? Margaret's eyes met mine, steady, unblinking. "When the time comes," she said, "you will not merely defend what is yours. You will shape Zenith's future." Her voice carried a certainty that felt almost prophetic. In that charged pause, I understood the depth of the gambit. I had asked for no favors, sought no spotlight. Yet here I was, threaded into a plan that required patience, restraint, and a quiet ferocity. As I rose to leave, the pen still warm in my palm, I felt something else unfurling inside me, a readiness I had not known I contained. The secret would be a mirror, and when the room finally looked into it, they would see themselves. Chapter 3: Humiliation and the Empty Box. The morning after my dismissal, I returned to the office carrying nothing but a cardboard box. It was light in my hands, yet unbearably heavy in its meaning. Corridors of Zenith stretched ahead like a gauntlet, each fluorescent light humming above me as though marking my shame. My heels struck the polished floor, every step magnified in my mind until it sounded like a drumbeat of defeat. People noticed. Course they did. Some froze when they saw me coming, others shifted papers, typed furiously, or suddenly found something fascinating on their screens. But the truth lived in their eyes. They did not meet mine, not directly. Instead, they offered sidelong glances, half curious, half pitying. No one spoke. The silence in that hallway was not ordinary silence. It was the weight of something unspoken, a pressure pressing down on my lungs. When I pushed open the door to my office, still mine in spirit if not in title, I was met with the familiar scent of paper and ink, the faint trace of coffee, the walls lined with fragments of a life built within these boundaries. I set the empty box on the desk, the sound hollow, and began to pack. The first items were the photographs. Smiling teams after impossible projects, group shots with exhausted faces but triumphant grins. These frames held proof of what I had given, proof of what we had achieved. I wrapped them carefully, though my fingers trembled, not because of fear but because every image was a reminder of battles fought and survived. Next were the notebooks, dozens of them, thick with scribbles, margins filled with diagrams, arrows, desperate recalculations. Each one was a record of nights spent clawing the company back from collapse, of strategies sketched in the margins of flight itineraries, of lifelines extended at the very last moment. Then there was the chipped coffee mug. It looked ordinary, almost pitiful. But it had been with me through the darkest nights, when exhaustion blurred the edges of my vision, when caffeine was less a stimulant than a companion. I placed it gently in the box, treating it with the reverence others might reserve for crystal. Through it all, the golden pen stayed in the breast pocket of my jacket. My fingers brushed against it as I moved, each touch a pulse of defiance. They thought I was leaving as a discarded employee. They did not know I was leaving as Zenith's largest shareholder. That pen was not merely a reminder of my past, it was a weapon for my future. As I folded the coat draped over my chair, the memories came unbidden. They hit harder than Julian's cold dismissal. Airports at midnight, where I slept on plastic chairs while waiting for the first flight to a city where a contract teetered on the edge of collapse. Dawn phone calls to factories across the globe, scrambling to reroute supply chains when disaster had struck. And then the memory that never failed to sting, the day my mother died. I had been in the office that day. A hurricane had crippled the port, severing our logistics. I was on the phone with 3 continents at once, orchestrating what felt like a symphony of chaos. My sister had called, her voice breaking. "She's fading. You need to come now." And I had said, "I can't. Not yet. Zenith needs me." By the time I allowed myself to leave, it was too late. That choice had carved itself into me like a scar no one else could see. The world looked at me and saw discipline, sacrifice, leadership. But beneath it all was a wound that would never heal, a whisper I carried into every decision. "You failed her." I placed the coat gently in the box, as if it too bore the weight of my regrets. The silence of the office was pierced by a soft buzz. My phone, face down on the desk, vibrated once, then again. I turned it over, expecting another shallow condolence or worse, silence from those who had once called themselves colleagues. The message was from Clara. Clara, who had stood by me in warehouses colder than winter itself, who had sat across from me at 2 in the morning recalculating shipments until the numbers finally fit. Clara, who knew what loyalty meant not as a word but as an act. Her message was brief. "No one here forgets you, Evelyn." "Never." My throat tightened. The words glowed against the screen, simple yet alive with a truth I desperately needed. It wasn't grand speeches or public acknowledgments that mattered. It was this, quiet recognition from those who understood, who had been in the trenches with me, who knew the price I had paid. I closed my eyes, and for the first time that morning, I felt something other than humiliation. Pride, subtle, fragile, but real, stirred within me. Julian could strip me of my office, parade my dismissal as a triumph of his so-called cultural reform. He could invite the board to applaud his ruthlessness, pretend my career was a relic best discarded. But he could not erase the truth of what I had built. He could not erase the respect I carried from those who knew me, truly knew me. Cardboard box was no longer empty. It was filled with fragments of a life that mattered, not because of titles or corner offices, but because of the sacrifices etched into every artifact. And though I carried it with bowed shoulders, I was not leaving with nothing. I was leaving with dignity. with the trust of those who understood. With the knowledge that I still held the future of Zenith in my hands, even if no one else in that building realized it. I tightened my grip on the box and lifted my chin. The walk down that hallway would still feel long, the stairs would still sting, but I was no longer the humiliated employee they thought they saw. I was Evelyn Harper. And this was not an ending. It was the prelude to the fight that was yet to come. Chapter 4: Seeds of Resistance. By Thursday, the atmosphere within Zenith had shifted noticeably. Whispers filled the corridors like an invisible current, and every conversation seemed to carry Julian Voss's name. He had summoned his first executive leadership meeting, a grand debut of sorts. I was not invited, of course. But absence did not mean ignorance. Stories traveled quickly in a place where ambition was currency. A colleague described the scene to me later. Julian had walked into the boardroom with the confidence of a monarch surveying his new kingdom. His suit was immaculate, his tie deliberately bold, as if color could substitute for competence. He spoke with a clipped, sharp cadence, announcing sweeping changes as though he had already carved the future into stone. And then came the words that would reach me within the hour. Zenith cannot afford to be sentimental. We are shackled by the weight of outdated practices. People like Evelyn Harper, outdated infrastructure, must be removed if we are to thrive. The phrasing was brutal in its simplicity. Dated infrastructure. As though I were nothing more than rusted steel beams holding up a structure he planned to demolish. I could endure replacement. Time makes way for the next generation, and I had long accepted that. But to reduce my life's work, decades of sacrifice, into an expendable fixture? It was an insult carved deep into my very bones. Anger surged, hot and relentless. My first impulse was to storm into that room, to remind him of the nights I had navigated Zenith through storms both literal and financial. To lay bare the cost of my devotion, the mother I lost while keeping this company afloat, the years of my life poured into its foundations. But I stopped myself. Margaret's warning echoed within me. We will keep this secret. Let arrogance reveal itself. So I swallowed the fury, not as defeat but as preparation. Julian was sowing his own downfall, word by word. He did not know that the outdated infrastructure he dismissed held the keys to nearly half of Zenith's future. And then something shifted. Clara called me that afternoon. Her voice was steady but carried an undercurrent of defiance. "Evelyn," she said, "you should know, people here are furious. They might keep their heads down in front of Julian, but behind closed doors, they remember who kept Zenith alive. They remember you." Her words lit something inside me, a spark I hadn't realized I still carried. I had returned to my apartment thinking my role was merely to endure until the right moment arrived. But resistance was already sprouting within the company. Quiet, subtle, but real. Julian believed power was his by declaration. He didn't yet understand that power in its truest form is loyalty. And loyalty cannot be commanded, it is earned. As I hung up the phone, I realized this was no longer just about survival. The seeds of resistance had been planted. And when the time came, they would bloom into something far stronger than arrogance could ever control. A young analyst I had once mentored, Liam, reached out late that evening. His message was brief but urgent. "You should listen to this. They don't deserve to get away with it." Attached was an audio file. With a steadying breath, I pressed play. Julian's voice spilled through my speakers, sharp and dripping with contempt. "Relics like Evelyn Harper are anchors dragging us down. Her dismissal will stand as a symbol of change." The words cut, but not in the way he might have intended. They no longer wounded me, they empowered me. The arrogance, the disdain, the casual cruelty, it was all there, captured in pristine clarity. The file wasn't just proof. It was a weapon. For the first time since my public humiliation, I smiled. A slow, deliberate smile that came not from joy but from recognition. Julian thought he had silenced me, erased me, reduced me to a discarded footnote in Zenith's story. But in his own voice, he had given me the sharpest blade imaginable. I leaned back in my chair, replaying the recording. Every syllable carried the weight of his hubris. Every pause, every sneer revealed the truth about the man now parading himself as Zenith's savior. This was not leadership. This was vanity dressed in a tailored suit. My fingers traced the edge of the golden pen still resting on my desk. Margaret's gift, the symbol of trust, now felt heavier, charged with new purpose. Pen was for creation, for signing futures into being. But this recording, it was for dismantling illusions. Together, they formed the perfect balance, one to preserve Zenith, the other to expose what threatened it. Julian believed that declaring me obsolete would cement his authority. Instead, he had carved his own epitaph. And when the time came, his own words, arrogant, unguarded, damning, would be the chisel. For now, I tucked the file safely away. Timing was everything. Margaret had told me to wait, to let the mask slip. And I would. But the storm was no longer just looming, it was gathering strength inside me. Julian thought he had ended my story. He had no idea he had just written its next chapter. Chapter 5, The Boardroom Meeting. Friday morning arrived with a tension that seemed to thicken the very air inside Zenith's headquarters. The boardroom, lined with polished oak panels and chandeliers that glimmered like fragments of power itself, was filled with the quiet rustle of papers, the muted clink of water glasses, and the unspoken weight of expectation. The far end of the long mahogany table sat a single, unoccupied chair. A small brass plaque in front of it read in bold, gleaming letters, "Reserved for the largest shareholder." Every pair of eyes in the room had been drawn to it at least once, flickering with curiosity, anxiety, or calculation. Yet no one knew whose presence would soon fill that seat. Julian Voss, standing confidently at the head of the table, radiated the kind of bravado that only came from ignorance or arrogance. His suit was flawless, his tie perfectly knotted, his jaw set in what he clearly thought was an image of authority. He tapped his fingers lightly on the table before spreading his arms with a smile too wide to be sincere. "The future of Zenith," he declared, voice booming, "is clear. Our new major shareholder has expressed their complete support of my vision. Their absence here today is simply a formality, a technicality in the process. What matters is this: they back me 100%. Murmurs rippled through the board, though no one dared to challenge him directly. For years, these directors had learned to survive by aligning themselves with the loudest voice in the room. But even among them, unease was beginning to stir. From just outside the frosted glass doors, I stood silently, listening. My hand tightened around the golden pen resting in my palm. The metal was warm against my skin, pulsing like a living reminder of Margaret's faith in me, of the legacy I now carried. Through the muffled barrier, Julian's voice still cut sharp and smug. "We will cut what no longer serves us. We will strip away the inefficiencies, the sentimental anchors of the past. Zenith will move faster, strike harder, and outpace every competitor." My heart pounded, but not with fear. With clarity. With purpose. Then the balance shifted. A secretary hurried into the room, clutching a leather folder with both hands. Her eyes darted nervously as she leaned close to Julian and whispered something inaudible to the others. She slid the folder onto the table before him, the papers inside crisp, freshly printed. Here, sir," she stammered. "The ownership records, updated this morning." For the briefest moment, Julian froze. His posture stiffened. His smile faltered. His eyes flicked rapidly across the pages as if searching for a line that might rescue him. The room caught the hesitation. His pause was a fracture in the mask of control. He looked up, forcing his grin back into place, but the charm rang hollow now. "As I was saying," he continued, his tone louder, strained, "the largest shareholder supports my leadership entirely. You need not concern yourselves with the details. I assure you, Zenith's direction is firm, decisive, and under control. But the directors were no longer convinced. Their eyes, sharp and seasoned from years of navigating corporate storms, had already noticed the slip. Whispers fluttered like moths along the table. A single truth hung in the air: something was wrong. I exhaled slowly, adjusting the lapel of my blazer. Time had come. With deliberate steps, I pushed open the heavy doors. The hinges groaned softly, drawing every head toward me. The room fell into silence so complete that I could hear the echo of my heels against the marble floor. I walked toward the empty chair, my gaze level, my expression calm. The bouquet of carnations was gone, the naive gesture of goodwill abandoned. In its place, I carried only the golden pen and the quiet storm building inside me. Gasps rippled around the table. A few directors straightened in their seats, eyes widening in recognition. Others exchanged puzzled glances, uncertain how to interpret my presence. Julian's face drained of color, then flushed crimson. His jaw clenched, his composure unraveling in real time. "Evelyn Harper," he spat, attempting a sneer but failing to disguise the quiver in his voice. "You don't belong here. This meeting is for the board and the shareholder who—" I placed the golden pen gently on the plaque before the empty chair. The engraved brass glinted beneath the chandelier's light. Then, without rushing, I lowered myself into the seat marked, reserved for the largest shareholder. The silence cracked into chaos. Voices rose, questions erupted, the room surged with disbelief. I let them buzz for a moment before speaking, my voice calm but resonant, carrying through the storm of murmurs. "Good morning," I said evenly. "Allow me to introduce myself, not as Zenith's former executive, not as its discarded past, but as the owner of 45% of this company's shares. By all legal definitions, that makes me the largest shareholder in this room." The effect was electric. Several directors leaned back, stunned. Others immediately shifted their expressions, recalibrating their loyalties as if a switch had been flipped. Julian's mask shattered completely. He slammed a hand on the table, veins bulging at his temple. "This is impossible. Those shares were Margaret's. Margaret entrusted them to me," I interrupted, my voice steady, steel laced beneath its calm surface. "2 nights ago, I signed the papers with the very pen that founded Zenith. Your information is outdated, Julian. And so is your vision." I paused, letting the weight of my words settle. Then, almost gently, I reached into my folder and withdrew the audio file Liam had given me. "There is something else you should all hear," I said, sliding the small speaker onto the polished wood. Julian's eyes widened, panic sparking in their depths. The recording played, his own voice booming in the hushed chamber. "Relics like Evelyn Harper are anchors dragging us down. Her dismissal will stand as a symbol of change." The words reverberated, each syllable hammering against the walls, stripping Julian of any pretense of dignity. Gasps turned into murmurs of outrage. Several directors shook their heads in disapproval. I leaned forward, folding my hands atop the table. "This is your leader," I said quietly. "A man who mistakes arrogance for vision, who confuses cruelty with strength, who believes discarding loyalty is the same as progress." I let my gaze sweep across the room, meeting the eyes of each director in turn. "You know me. You know what I have sacrificed to keep Zenith alive. I am not asking for sympathy. I am asking for clarity. Who here truly believes this man embodies the future of Zenith? And who is ready to stand with someone who has already proven their commitment, time and time again?" The room shifted. Directors exchanged looks heavy with calculation. But beneath their caution, I saw it. The spark of recognition, the return of respect. Julian opened his mouth, but no words came. For the first time, he was silent. I sat taller in my chair, the golden pen gleaming before me. The battle was no longer about my dismissal. It was about Zenith's soul. And in that moment, I knew the tide had turned. It was time. I pushed the doors open with deliberate force, the polished brass handles cold against my palms. The sound of my heels striking the marble floor echoed like the steady beat of a war drum. Each step carried the weight of 25 years, each step a reminder that I was not walking into exile but into reclamation. The boardroom froze. Conversations cut short. Pens hovered midair. Even the faint hum of the overhead lights seemed to recede into silence. At the head of the table, Julian stiffened, his confidence shattering in a single heartbeat. His eyes widened, not with rage but with fear, the kind that cracks through arrogance when reality shifts beneath it. For one fleeting moment, I saw the boy behind the title, the pretender clutching at power he could not hold. "This is a mistake," Julian stammered, his voice cracking as he gripped the leather folder before him. "Evelyn has been dismissed. She has no right to be here." I didn't answer. Not yet. Instead, I stood still, letting my silence spread like wildfire through the room. Power, I had learned long ago, was not always in words. It was in presence, in the refusal to justify your existence. The directors stirred uneasily. Their whispers filled the void, sharp and speculative. They sensed the shift. They could smell it. Authority was no longer where Julian had claimed it to be. I walked slowly toward the chair at the far end of the table, the one reserved for the largest shareholder. I did not sit. Not yet. Instead, I placed the golden pen on the gleaming surface of the mahogany table. Under the chandelier, it glowed, a beacon of legitimacy, of history, of ownership. The message was clear. I didn't need to argue. Pen spoke for me. Finally, I broke the silence. My voice was calm, measured, but laced with steel. "I do not accept the decision to terminate me." The air fractured. Gasps cut through the silence. Papers rustled as directors leaned forward. Every eye in the room darted between Julian and me, waiting to see who would falter first. Julian slammed his fist onto the table, his composure gone. "You are undermining everything. The board has no obligation to recognize you. You are clinging to—" "Enough," a voice interrupted. It came from Hammond, the eldest director, a man who had been on the board since Zenith weathered its first major crisis. His gray hair and furrowed face bore the marks of a career spent steering companies through storms. His hand rose, steady and deliberate. "I vote for Evelyn." The words hit like a thunderclap. Julian blinked, momentarily stunned. "You what?" Hammond leaned back in his chair, folding his hands across his chest. "I vote for Evelyn Harper to retain her position. Not as a sentimental gesture, not as nostalgia, but because I know the difference between a leader who builds and a man who destroys." Murmurs erupted. A few directors nodded subtly, emboldened by Hammond's declaration. Others shifted nervously, sensing the tide was changing but unwilling to show their cards too soon. I met Hammond's gaze and gave a small nod of gratitude. His support wasn't just symbolic, it was catalytic. Cracked open the facade Julian had tried to hold together. Julian's face twisted with fury. "This is absurd. Evelyn is the past. She represents dead weight, traditions that choke progress. If Zenith is to survive, we must." I cut him off, my tone sharper now, slicing through his theatrics. "Progress is not built on arrogance, Julian. It is built on trust, sacrifice, and vision. You speak of survival as though cutting away loyalty makes us stronger. But survival without integrity is not strength, it is rot." The room went still again, my words settling into the cracks of Julian's collapsing authority. I stepped closer to the table, placing both hands firmly on its surface. "You all know me. You've seen me lead through crises you thought would sink this company. You've seen me sacrifice, sometimes more than I should have, for Zenith. I don't need to remind you of my record. What I ask is simple. Ask yourselves who you trust with the future of this company. A man who dismisses experience as relics, or a woman who has proven her loyalty and ability at every turn. Julian's breathing quickened, shallow and angry. He looked around the room, searching for allies, but found only hesitation. The director's eyes avoided his, unwilling to tether themselves to a sinking ship. "Don't be deceived," he hissed. "She's manipulating you, using theatrics too." Another director, Ms. Patel, cut in sharply. "What about the ownership records?" Her dark eyes fixed on Julian like a hawk. "We all saw the secretary hand you the updated documents. What did they say?" Julian froze. His mouth opened, but no sound came. I straightened, my voice steady. "They confirm what you already suspect. I am Zenith's largest shareholder. 45%. That chair," I gestured to the plaque, "is mine by right." Gasps rippled through the room again, but this time they carried awe. Julian's face drained of color. He sputtered, "Margaret, she couldn't have." "She did," I said simply. "She entrusted Zenith's future to me. And in her wisdom, she gave this company a chance to be more than one man's ego project." I finally lowered myself into the chair marked for the largest shareholder. The golden pen gleamed in front of me like a seal of fate. Julian's voice cracked into desperation. "This is treachery. You'll destroy Zenith. You'll drag us back into weakness." But his words fell flat. The directors weren't listening anymore. They were looking at me. And in their eyes, I saw something I hadn't felt in days: respect. Hammond cleared his throat. "I second my vote. Evelyn Harper remains a force within this company. I propose we take this to an immediate vote of confidence." The board stirred, the momentum undeniable now. The whispers carried not fear but resolve. One by one, directors raised their hands, not all, but enough to shift the balance unmistakably. Julian stood frozen, trembling with rage, his empire collapsing around him in real time. His voice, once booming with false authority, was reduced to a whisper no one cared to hear. I leaned back in my chair, my hands folded over the golden pen. For the first time since this ordeal began, I allowed myself a quiet, steady breath. This was no longer about survival. It was about restoration, about reclaiming not just my dignity but Zenith's soul. And as the votes were cast, sealing Julian's downfall, I knew the war was far from over. But the first battle, perhaps the most important, was mine. The first nod felt like the spark of a long-awaited fire. Then another head bowed in agreement, and another still. One by one, the director's loyalties slipped from Julian's grasp like sand escaping a clenched fist. His eyes darted across the table, searching desperately for a friendly face, for a single ally willing to rescue him from the abyss. But no one would meet his gaze. The silence spoke louder than any words. His power, once inflated with arrogance and showmanship, was evaporating before him. I drew the golden pen from its case with deliberate calm, letting the weight of the moment rest on every shoulder in the room. The directors leaned forward as I set it down upon the stack of ownership documents. Pen caught the light of the chandelier above, refracting a sharp glint that seemed almost like fire. "Margaret Langston gave me this pen," I said, my voice steady, each syllable measured. "On the day I became Zenith's largest shareholder, she placed it in my hand and told me that leadership is not about ambition, it's about guardianship. It is about loyalty. It is about willpower strong enough to protect this company through storms and betrayals." I let the pause linger. That is the founder's intent. That is the truth you cannot erase. Julian's face drained of color. He clutched the folder before him as though it could shield him, but it was nothing more than a hollow shell of a lie. With one fluid motion, I lowered the pen to the document and pressed ink to paper. The golden lines carved across the page with the force of a blade cleaving through years of deceit. The sound of the nib scratching against parchment echoed louder than thunder in Julian's ears. When I finished, I lifted my eyes and fixed him with a gaze as unyielding as steel. "From this moment forward, you report directly to me." For a second, the room was frozen in suspended time. No one breathed. Power shifted invisibly but undeniably, the axis of Zenith turning away from Julian and back to its rightful course. Then came the sound. Applause. Not the hollow, forced clapping of courtiers before a tyrant, but the genuine, deliberate rhythm of people who had waited too long for justice. It wasn't loud, but it was resolute. It was the sound of truth finding its voice again. Julian sagged into his chair, his body deflating as though the very air of his authority had been punctured. His hand shook, the folder slipping from his grip and falling to the polished table with a dull thud. The mighty reformer, the self-proclaimed visionary, looked suddenly small, merely a man exposed for his vanity. I slipped the golden pen back into my jacket pocket and straightened, allowing myself the smallest smile. It wasn't triumph I felt, it was clarity. Zenith never needed men like Julian, intoxicated by spectacle and desperate for power. What it needed were protectors. People willing to bleed for its survival, who understood that sacrifice was the foundation of every true success. I drew a long breath and spoke again, this time to the whole room. This company is not a stage for egos. It is not a ladder for opportunists to climb. It is a living legacy, built on the sweat of engineers, the resolve of leaders, and the faith of those who came before us. And as long as I hold this position, Zenith will not be a kingdom ruled by fear. It will be a house protected by loyalty. A murmur of assent rippled across the table. Men and women who had sat in silence under Julian's regime now straightened, emboldened. They weren't just following me, they were remembering who they had once been before fear muzzled them. Julian stirred, as if clinging to the last shred of dignity. His lips parted, but no words came. Only a strangled rasp, half fury, half despair. "Mr. Voss," I said evenly, "your tenure of unchecked power ends today. You may remain in this company, but not as its master. You will serve it as an employee, accountable to the same rules you tried to twist for your gain. And you will answer to me." He flinched, but offered no protest. The fight had gone out of him. I turned to the board. There will be changes. Not the reckless cuts Julian promised, but reforms guided by clarity and respect. Zenith will grow, not by discarding its roots, but by honoring them. The directors nodded. Relief settled over the room like sunlight breaking through clouds. For the first time in weeks, my chest felt light. The rage, the sleepless nights, the humiliations, they hadn't been endured in vain. I looked once more at Julian, his shoulders slumped, his eyes hollow. A part of me pitied him, but not enough to forgive the damage he had tried to inflict. His arrogance had been his undoing. His own words, preserved in that damning recording, had placed the dagger in my hand. All I had to do was use it. And now I had. The meeting drew to a close, but the echo of applause lingered in my mind. Not as flattery, not as personal glory, but as a promise. Company had chosen its path, and I had chosen mine. As I left the boardroom, the golden pen resting against my heart, I knew this battle was won. But I also knew the war was far from over. Julian would not vanish quietly, and the forces he courted outside these walls might still test me. Yet in that moment, standing at the threshold of the boardroom where justice had been restored, I felt unbreakable. Because Zenith had its guardian back. And I, Evelyn Harper, was no longer just the woman they tried to discard. I was the keeper of the legacy. I was the shield. And I would not falter. Conclusion. When I stepped out of the boardroom, I did not feel triumph. There was no intoxication of victory, no smug satisfaction that might tempt a lesser spirit. What I felt was release, a quiet unshackling of chains I had carried for far too long. I had proven that arrogance cannot withstand loyalty, that 25 years of sacrifice cannot be erased by a single declaration. Zenith was mine, not merely on paper, but in every brick, every sleepless night, every difficult choice I had made to keep the company alive when it should have collapsed. And Julian Voss, with his defeated stare and trembling hands, would never forget the moment he realized he had underestimated a woman who carried not a sword, not a crown, but a golden pen. The corridor outside the boardroom was hushed, yet I felt its walls vibrating with unspoken recognition. Employees would soon learn of what had transpired, and rumors would ripple like waves. But for once, the whispers would not be about my dismissal or obsolescence. They would be about a return, about justice. I paused by a tall window overlooking the city. The skyline shimmered with early afternoon light, glass towers catching fire in the sun. For years, I had seen these same towers as monuments to progress, but today they appeared different. They looked fragile, almost transparent, as if reminding me that power, no matter how formidable, was never permanent. Truth is, I did not win because I was invincible. I won because I endured. Because I remembered who I was when others tried to write me off as irrelevant. And standing there, I realized that my story carried lessons, not just for me, but for anyone who has ever been pushed aside, silenced, or underestimated. Lesson 1: Loyalty outlasts arrogance. Julian believed loyalty was weakness. He dismissed it as sentimentality, clinging instead to aggression and spectacle. But loyalty is not fragility. It is the steel thread that binds people and institutions across decades. My loyalty to Zenith became my anchor, gave me strength when humiliation cut deep. And in the end, it was that loyalty, visible in every decision I made, that outlasted his arrogance. If you are ever tempted to believe that selfish ambition is the only way forward, remember this: arrogance builds empires quickly, but loyalty sustains them for generations. Lesson 2: Silence can be a strategy. When Julian mocked me as obsolete infrastructure, every part of me wanted to lash back, to storm into his meeting and confront him. But silence was my weapon. I let his words echo, let him believe he had silenced me while I gathered my strength. Silence is not surrender. It is often the sharpest blade, waiting for the right moment to strike. If you are cornered, don't confuse restraint with weakness. Sometimes the most powerful move is the one you do not make. Yet, Lesson 3: Symbols carry power. The golden pen was not just metal and ink. It was a promise from Margaret Langston, a founder. I remembered that I was not disposable, that my presence was part of something larger than myself. When I placed that pen on the boardroom table, it spoke louder than any speech could. In your own life, remember the weight of symbols. Whether it is a ring, a photograph, a handwritten note, these objects remind you of who you are when the world tries to convince you otherwise. Lesson 4: Resilience is built in shadows, not spotlight. People saw me step into the boardroom and reclaim Zenith as though it was sudden, effortless. But they did not see the years in the shadows. Years of fighting through exhaustion, of swallowing insults, of carrying burdens no one acknowledged. Resilience is not crafted in the moments of applause, but in the long nights when no one is watching. Do not despise the shadows. They are where your strength is forged. Lesson 5: Victory is not revenge, but restoration. When Julian crumbled before me, I could have felt vindicated. I could have relished his humiliation. But what I felt was relief. Because victory, in its truest form, is not about crushing others. It is about restoring balance, bringing justice, reclaiming what was nearly lost. My triumph was not Julian's defeat. My triumph was Zenith's restoration. So, when life offers you victory, do not squander it on bitterness. Use it to rebuild, to heal, to restore what deserves to live. As I left the building that day, the pen secure in my pocket, I did not look back. Not because I was indifferent, but because I knew the past no longer held me captive. The battles, the betrayals, the sleepless nights, they had all shaped me, but they did not define me. Zenith would move forward. And so would I. The city outside seemed brighter. The streets louder. Even the faces of strangers glowed with a kind of familiarity, as if they too carried battles invisible to the eye. I thought of them, of the countless people who have been dismissed, underestimated, told they were too old, too soft, too irrelevant. My story was theirs in another form. And so, as I walked into the light of a new chapter, I carried not only Zenith's legacy but also the quiet hope that my journey would remind others. You are never truly finished. You are never too small to rise. And sometimes all it takes is a single act, a word, a decision, a signature with a golden pen, to rewrite the narrative others tried to write for you. To everyone listening, reading, or walking their own difficult path, take these lessons with you. Remember them when you are overlooked, when arrogance seems to tower above you, when silence feels unbearable. You are stronger than you think. And your resilience may one day turn the tide in a room that was never meant to welcome you. If my story resonated with you, if you found strength in these lessons, I ask you to share it. Pass it on to someone who might need to hear that loyalty, silence, symbols, resilience, and restoration are not just abstract ideals. They are tools of survival and triumph. Like this story, share it with your friends, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel so more people can join us in uncovering stories of resilience, betrayal, and the quiet victories that change everything. 'Cause stories like these are not just entertainment. They are reminders of what we can endure and who we can become.